or is it by the Canadian Prime Minister going there? You know? And this is discussed as if it was serious. That's the interesting part. I mean, this is discussed as if, you know, it's not 40 million Mexicans die laughing, which it ought to be. You know, it's discussed as if it could conceivably be serious. It can't possibly be serious. The only question is how to make sure that Cuba will go back into the box in which it was supposed to be put in 1820. If they can force it back there by one or another means, fine, we'll accept Cuba. We'll even call it a democracy, even if it's run by some brutal murderer, you know, like we call Mexico a democracy, or we call Colombia a democracy. In fact, the best democracy in the hemisphere, even has an independent political party, you know, which was allowed to function in 1985. Since that time, about 3,000 of its activists have been murdered, mostly by security forces and paramilitary forces, including every presidential candidate and most of the mayors. But, you know, it's there. It's got to be a democracy. And since we love democracy so much, we think it's fine. You know. But so maybe if Cuba ends up with democracy like that, it'll be fine as long as it follows orders. You know, there ought to be 100 million Americans who die laughing over this. And the fact that they're not is an indication of the grip of the doctrinal system, which is really powerful. And in this case, primarily among the more educated sectors. You know, I mean, if they don't know these things, it's a conscious decision not to know. It takes work not to know these things. Like, you don't have to, you know, really explore.
Given that it's a battle for the minds of the masses and the fact that it's critical to mobilize those masses to achieve any rights for workers, do you see any solutions short of revolution?
Sure. I mean, the solutions that have worked all through history. I mean, how did workers' rights get established more or less in the 1930s?
Revolution.
There was no revolution. I mean, there was a threat. There was certainly a threat. Like when, you know, when working people took over General Motors. Yeah, that's no joke. People got scared. Yeah, okay. Because the next thing they'll come to their heads is, what do we need the bosses for? You know, like maybe they'll get as smart as the factory girls in Lowell, you know, 150 years ago and say, look, we don't need those guys, we'll run it ourselves. You know? And you got to make sure that that doesn't happen, because that's really trouble. So yes, there was an accommodation. And in fact, right through history, that's the way it's worked. I mean, nowadays, people who consider themselves more or less progressive, whatever that term is supposed to mean, think that they got a pretty rotten life. Look at our problems. Well, you know, there's plenty of problems, but it's a lot better than it was 30 years ago, let alone 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So like nowadays, you're worried about how to defend protect some kind of medical system. Worrying about that 30 years ago, there wasn't any. You know? Or take, say, women's rights. Okay, plenty of problems about women's rights, like, you know, the way affirmative action's being used to attack people. It wasn't a problem 30 years ago. There was no rights. You know, or take, you know, issue after issue. It's just things are over time. You know, the struggles take off from a higher level than before. So, like you think it looks bad for labor now? Have a look at the 1920s. You know, the fall of the House of Labor in a most undemocratic America, when workers could do nothing more than try to pursue individual survival strategies. And remember, that was the period of mass industrialization, you know, establishment of the automobile industry. It's like not a rural country. Well, what you do is try to keep making things better. Is it a revolution or not? That's kind of like a question of definition. I mean, if it's possible, I mean, I think myself, I agree with those mill hands in Massachusetts that the people who work in the mills ought to own them, generalized. Well, all right, if there's steps toward that happening, I guess you could call it a revolution, but I don't see why it shouldn't just happen.
I'm referring back to your comments about the media and the great public relations that ploy and
right. But see, I think all that stuff is totally illegitimate. I mean, and that goes way back to something much earlier. Why should corporations have any rights at all? Okay. I mean, that's not like it's not in the Constitution. You know, corporate rights are the result. It's not even by legislation. I mean, corporate rights were achieved mostly through courts and lawyers, and pretty recently. You know, the main decisions are early in this century. Like, it's not founded in, you know, it's not graven in stone or anything like that. Actually, there's pretty good literature on this if you're interested. The best book is by a Harvard professor that I know, a guy named Morton Horowitz, who's at the law school, has a couple of books called Transformation of American Law. One of them, I think, goes up till like 1860, and the other from maybe 1860 to 1960. But the main theme of the book, of these two big volumes, it's interesting reading. You know, it sounds kind of dense and so on, but you find it interesting reading. The main theme is how the legal system was reshaped to accommodate to the needs of private power. Okay, all the way through, that's been the main theme of the legal system: how to modify it so that illegitimate tyrannical authority is given more and more power, undermining democratic principles. That's basically, he doesn't say it in those words, but that's what it comes down to. And the big step, you know, the major step probably, was the transfer of rights to private tyrannies, which is what corporations are, early in this century. And as he points out, he doesn't go into it much, but I think he's right, this developed out of ideas, kind of Hegelian ideas about the rights of organic entities over individuals, which are also at the roots of Bolshevism and fascism. And I should mention that that comparison may sound exotic now, but it wasn't 60 years ago. You read, say, mainstream American political economists like Robert Brady, important political economist, was kind of Veblenite, back around the early 1940s, I guess. He wrote books about, big business's system of power, things like that, in which he points out, these things are basically totalitarian in structure, which they are. So where'd they get their rights? Well, through courts and lawyers, by playing one state against one another. Incidentally, that's something worth thinking about when you listen to this devolution business now. The point of getting power down to the states is so that any business, even a middle-sized business, can make sure that the money goes into their pockets, not in the pockets of poor people. It's trickier to do it at the federal level. So that's why you get all this new philosophy about, federalism and so on. Not that federalism would be bad, but, not when you got private tyrannies around. This establishment of private corporate power is a dramatic example of that. Back, I forget exactly what year, but like early in this century, maybe around 1905 or something, the state of New Jersey figured it could make a killing by getting the big corporations to move from New York, where they always were, over to New Jersey, simply by giving them a lot of gifts. It's kind of like when Alabama gets investment from Germany. The taxpayers pay for it, but somebody makes a killing. And that's exactly what they did. So New Jersey gave corporations all sorts of gifts, essentially, to move across the river. And that's why you have so many things called, Standard Oil of New Jersey and that sort of thing. Yeah, because they moved across the river so they could be incorporated there. And it's a lot cheaper for the big power because the taxpayers of New Jersey paid them. Delaware was another case. Well, of course, New York had to accommodate, because everybody's moving across the river. That's the new federalism back at the early part of this century. So that's and by such a mechanism, public funds did end up in big, deep private pockets, and corporations gradually got rights that that are, in my opinion, totally illegitimate. Those rights can be taken away very simply, without a revolution. In fact, every corporation has a state charter, and they're supposed to be there for some public good, Well, it was true maybe 200 years ago. Like 200 years ago, we could establish a corporation that would build a bridge across the Charles River or something. Okay, that's what a corporation was supposed to be. It's changed a bit over the years. By now, they are huge tyrannies. Bigger than states, involved in all kind of strategic interactions with one another in violation of any conceivable market principle and so on and so forth. There's no reason why they should exist. I don't think. And the media is just part of it.